Hello, my name is Pam Franks. I'm the class of 1956 director of the Williams College Museum of Art. And tonight, it's so wonderful to see all of you. We are gathered here. Sorry, I didn't mean to change your slide there. Tonight, it's so great to see you all here. We're gathered for the annual Plonsker Family Lecture in Contemporary Art, generously established in 1994 by Madeleine and Harvey Plonsker, class of 1961, and their son, Ted Plonsker, class of 1986. The Plonsker Lecture examines current issues within the field of contemporary art. For over 3 decades, this annual event has brought dozens of distinguished artists and creatives to Williams College campus, people who are thought leaders, change makers, activists, and visionaries. It's wonderful to have Madeleine and Harvey and Ted and Robin Plonsker here with us tonight. Thank you for being here. We are deeply grateful for the incredible opportunity that the Plonsker family's gift offers our community. Thank you. This year, we are honored to welcome artist Stephanie Syjuco as our featured lecturer. Stephanie's work as a multidisciplinary artist and educator showcases the powerful potential of re-narrating archives and histories that too often leave out the voices of the most marginalized members of our society. In 2024, we proudly added 2 of her photographs to Whitney's collection. We had a really wonderful time earlier today looking at the photographs with Stephanie and the Plonskers. And we're thrilled about the opportunities for sharing her stories, methodologies, and passion with our students and other audiences. Working in photography, sculpture, and installation, from handmade and craft-inspired mediums to digital editing and archive excavations, Stephanie has recently focused on how photography and image-based processes are implicated in the construction of exclusionary narratives of history and citizenship. Recognized nationally and internationally, she's the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship Award, a Joan Mitchell Painters and Sculptors Award, a Tiffany Foundation Award. Her work is in numerous collections, including Whitney's, of course, as I've just mentioned, including the Museum of Modern Art, the Metropolitan Museum, the Getty Museum, the Whitney Museum of American Art, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the Smithsonian American Art Museum, among many others. So we're delighted to be in that company and to be honored to be able to steward your work. She was a Smithsonian Artist Research Fellow at the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. in 2019 and 2020, and is featured in the acclaimed PBS documentary series Art 21, Art in the 21st Century. A longtime educator, she is an associate professor in sculpture at the University of California, Berkeley, and lives in Oakland, California. So tonight we're going to hear Stephanie talk for about 40 minutes, so we have ample time for question and answer. We understand you're open for questions, which will be great. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our 2025 Plonsker lecturer, Stephanie Syjuco.
All right, thank you so much for the introduction, also the invitation. It's really wonderful to be here. And I also just want to really give my thanks to the Plonsker family, because now more than ever, the arts need to be supported. I mean, I think there's a lot going on in the world. There's a lot of issues that we all have to keep dealing with. And part of the works that I chose to share today actually revisit some of moments in American history and also the questions that somehow keep coming up. So again, thanks for being here, everyone. I'm gonna keep a timer, so if I look at my phone down, it's not because I wanna be somewhere else, it's because I just wanna make sure that we leave time for the Q&A. So I'll start it right now, and also just say, let's see, I'm gonna try to plow through a lot. If I seem to run out of time, I think I'm just gonna stop. So bear with me. But the title of my talk is Image Trafficking and Archival Plunder. My work recycles, copies, resuscitates, warps, reframes, rips off, plunders, and hinges on existing forms and historical archives, because the past is still unfinished business. some of the creative tactics that I employ, and I made this list mostly for my art students, because if I open up with a proposition like that, the question invariably comes up of like, well, what does that look like? I mean, how do you do all these things? And so, in thinking about some of my recent projects, similar to Richard Serra's verb list, what I wind up doing are things like obfuscating, layering or piling, fragmenting, damaging, crumpling, folding, employing selective cropping, editing, or framing, pixelating, downsampling, blurring, removing, healing, inverting, reversing, presenting in as-is condition, rephotographing, republishing, reprinting, revealing, releasing, and even re-archiving. So what I also like to start off with is I've been a professional artist for almost 30 years now, and prior to the work that I started doing in archives, which really only has been for about 6 years, I used to work in large-scale installations where I would collaborate with different institutions to create mainly social practice engaged projects. So this would involve working sometimes with the public, as well as producing and displaying hundreds, sometimes even thousands of objects. Since then, though, the work has definitely branched out, and I like to share this as well, mostly as a pedagogical kind of explanation of how contemporary art can really encompass a lot of different avenues today. So even though my background is in sculpture, I definitely do lots of other things. And I also like to start off with this image because it's kind of an interesting introduction as to my motivations. So I myself was born in the Philippines, and I came over when I was 3 years old with my mother. And so this is an image actually of myself and my mother in 1979. We were at a photo studio in Disneyland's Frontierland. So if anyone's ever visited, it's the kind of Wild West area of Disneyland. And so my mother here, I'm 4 years old, and my mother is 22 years old, and we're posing as new Americans, as if coming over, say, in the 19th century, except it is 1979. And I look at this image because I think about how the construction of American identity, as well as how we see ourselves sometimes in the place of American history, is one of kind of fabrication, or even different types of allegiances depending on how we see ourselves as in or out of American history. I've also used that image as a kind of springboard to look at some of the works that I did post the 2016 election, when I really tried to shift towards thinking about how American history is kind of fabricated as well as enacted in different ways. And this is an interesting image because it shows an event called Civil War Days, which is a reenactment that happens in Guerneville, California. And if anyone knows anything about the Civil War, it did not happen in California. At least the battles did not. And so the people that show up to these reenactments, obviously they're attempting to kind of play out theatrics, as well as maybe grapple with some things that may or may not have settled. I was also looking at historical reenactment costumes or theatrical sewing patterns, and so you can see a selection of those on the left-hand side. And in thinking about this sort of staging of these spaces, the apparatus of of photography, as well as the kind of what should be looked at in the middle of the focus as opposed to what was on the periphery, rose to be something I was fascinated with. And so when thinking about photography and how this stock image, I think, is really influential for me, because all the objects that are usually on the periphery of the thing to be photographed have somehow migrated to the center and have become the subject of the photo studio itself. It all kind of coalesced in 2018 into a sculpture called The Visible Invisible, in which I handmade out of green screen chroma key backdrop fabric 3 iconic American costumes or garments from three iconic time periods of US history. So in the on the very left-hand side is the quote-unquote Plymouth Pilgrim made from a simplicity sewing pattern. In the very front is this very elaborate antebellum South costume. And in the back, or on the right-hand side, the Colonial Revolution or McCall's pattern. And this was commissioned for the Disrupting Craft exhibition at the Renwick Gallery, which is the American Smithsonian Craft Gallery that sits directly across from the White House. And at the time, I was also thinking, you know, these objects were positioned as if confrontationally towards the White House. But how I made these things expressly by hand was I learned 19th century sewing techniques. And so that included traditional ribbon embroidery, bonnet making, lace crochet. And I wanted to completely construct these kind of American garments by hand myself and make that connection between the idea of a fabricated history and then myself as someone who is attempting to kind of refabricate it with my own logic. So if anyone's familiar with the green screen backdrop, it's really meant as a kind of, it's used in digital imaging technology. And so the green you're not meant to see in the final digital image. You're supposed to be able to replace it with any image that you want. And I was thinking similarly about American history as this kind of cipher of what groups want to put narrative on top of it. I love this detail though. It is ribbon embroidery of flowers and little lace crocheted bits that, again, I handmade. And the entire installation took a year to learn how to make from scratch as well as fabricate. Because it's in a craft museum, I also needed to make sure it looked really good. So, you know, but at the same time, these garments are, they're not real. You know, they're theatrical garments. A lot of them are not. If anyone's an actual historian here in textiles, you would notice that there's something very off about them because they're composites of a kind of type of garment from these historical moments. But yeah, so proof that I made this. So as I'm looking at some of these historical things, I've also been privileged to get access to physical archives. And as I was saying, you know, for me, that really has been a very recent access point. Specifically in 2019, I was invited to do a project for the St. Louis Museum, or the Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis, working with curator Wesson Al-Khudairi for a solo exhibition. And she invited me to spend some time in the Louisiana Purchase Exposition collection at the Missouri Historical Society, because it turns out that the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904, which was this massive kind of exposition of both you know, American progressive industry and culture, was also a way for the United States to show off its colonial holdings. So the World's Fair was very, very well attended. It was kind of this mass production. It also featured, at the time, what were known as human zoos. And so the Philippines being an American colony at the time, there was a reconstruction of this kind of faux Philippine village, which featured over 1,200 Filipinos that were imported into St. Louis and then made to kind of perform cultural traditions for the American public. And so again, this kind of staged notion of a kind of otherness and how the United States positioned the Philippines as a kind of savage peoples to be educated and uplifted through American colonial power. So how do you talk back to these kinds of images? How do you also reckon with the many, many photographs that were taken at the time and still circulate, even though the history itself has kind of faded into the background and we may see ourselves as even more enlightened than the things that happened over 120 years ago? And so I bring up this image not just to kind of show, this is actually a fairly benign kind of image of people on display at the World's Fair, but the fact that they still circulate is something that I find interesting because it still kind of conscribes people into this typology. When I'm working in the archives, I it's actually a very boring process. I call forward documents and folders and files and photographs, and I sit there with a camera either on a tripod or sometimes even just holding it above, and I photograph and gather as many images as possible and invariably produce artwork. So one of the very first responses I had when looking at the hundreds of images of Filipinos put on display during the World's Fair was, after absorbing, the kind of litany of ethnographic style imagery, one of the biggest impulses I had was to literally kind of just block the ability for the viewer to keep absorbing those images in the way that they had circulated, which was essentially as tourist images. And so the project Block Out the Sun happened, in which I sat physically in the archive and literally used my hands and fingers to kind of deny the visibility, or to deny the gaze of the audience onto the people. It's a bit of a wishful thinking in the sense, because you can't remove images from the archives, and they're there to literally describe a historical event or fact. But myself as an artist can intervene in a way to hopefully humanize the situation in which the people were put in, as well as give them back their ability to not be viewed in that manner anymore. I think in the end I chose about 30 of these images, and you can kind of see the the context in which they were displayed in, and they wound up being put into a almost like a vitrine display case, and so you would have to walk around it to see, or attempt to kind of see or piece together the narrative of what was happening, even if you couldn't see the individuals depicted. Block Out the Sun was also a video, and so that there were way more images than I could potentially print and put into the vitrine. And so it's a looping video, and every time that an image changes into the next image, there's the sound of a camera shutter clicking, and I was able to source 100 years worth of different camera sounds. So 19th century cameras all the way up to contemporary digital cameras. So every time an image came forward, you heard a little click, and somehow it brought you back into a kind of more contemporary space. So again, thinking about the kind of apparatus of photography and all the things that also we're not supposed to see, even though they're highly visible in studio photography. On the left-hand side is the chroma key green backdrop, as I was explaining earlier. And on the right-hand side is this kind of intense checkerboard, gray and white checkerboard pattern that's known to digital imaging folks as a kind of like the last layer within Photoshop. It actually means that there's nothing behind this layer if you see it in there. And it's also highly visible, but you're not, it's not supposed to register as anything. It's a placeholder for like a vast sort of like nothingness behind the digital image. Also thinking about photographic conventions, I'm really fascinated by color calibration charts and how they use people or objects as kind of these stand-ins for correct color. This is the Ole no Moire color calibration chart by Adobe Systems that was made in the 1990s. And I did work as a graphic designer for a while, and this was the photo that they gave me to then check against images on my screen to make sure that they were the correct image. And yet this image I think is hilarious. Across the woman's head you can see the letters Adobe spelled out in blocks on her head, and then this kind of like odd Carmen Miranda, satirical figure. The other interesting thing about these calibration charts is they also hold, in some of these images, some normative references. So whether that's like, in this case, like a white heterosexual wedding, or like a very nice upper class, spread of food, these are the things that are offered to us as kind of the standard in which we check ourselves against. And then sometimes they just get totally random because people are just trying to throw together colorful things. And so here you have this wonderful array of children of different colors, of like a hot, sexy woman, and then just some, a landscape and candy. And then this is my favorite. This is like a hyper ethnic performance happening here, where this is also very common, where in order to kind of show off like different skin tones, the different people would be presented all together as a kind of variety. And this is the German version of that one, so everyone's a little morose looking, but you still have that kind of, the triad of like Black, Asian, and white characters as a kind of checking against to see if you can, if people fall in these categories. So after thinking a lot about the color conventions of American history, of colonial history, of all the sort of stagings that this entails, it all came together in this work called Dodge and Burn, in parentheses, visible storage. And this was also at the Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis, along with the blocked photographs. It's a giant wooden platform, and on top of it are over 100 objects. Some of them are made from digital images that have been downloaded and then printed. There's printed vinyl on laser cut wood, backdrop fabric, etc., and 2 garments and an American, kind of pale American flag. And so I fabricate all this from scratch, except for when I hire a digital fabric company to print the backdrops. But this kind of total staging and fabrication where I'm mashing up references of museum objects that have been downloaded from the Metropolitan Museum's collection of objects from the Philippines and then brought back into this staging, mixing it up with color calibration charts, cosmetic skin tone charts, textiles from the Philippines, this kind of mass profusion and almost a confusing kind of reference. You can kind of pick out, there's emojis that litter the stage around, as well as stock photos of tropical fruit that also still have the watermark of, say, iStock Photo or Getty on them. And littered around are also chroma key green objects that, for me, reference the kind of invisibility of white supremacy. So the green caps remind me of kind of mega-style caps. There's also a series of chroma key green painted tiki torches. Around this time, also the Charlottesville white supremacist marches were happening. And so these were all very forward in my mind, as well as also thinking through the legacies of white supremacy and colonialism in the United States, because these things didn't pop out of nowhere. There's a kind of continuum. And so this installation collapses these references together. And it's meant to be confusing. Like, I think, similar to when we find ourselves in these situations where you're trying to kind of make sense of all these things that don't make sense, it also reminds me, this installation reminds me of when you have too many browser windows open on your desktop and everything starts to overlap in different ways. And it's a stage set. So you can see here, there's knives that are Filipino knives that are kind of floating, images of masks downloaded from Amazon.com that kind of reference anti-fascist resistors at the time, and color calibration charts that litter everything. But the whole thing is a stage. You can kind of go behind it and realize that these are flat-fronted displays that are almost like props. And in behind and on the sides, there's a different kind of battle happening. There's rocks and bricks and even emojis that are kind of commenting on what's happening. So the little poop emojis are actually dotting around the caps and the tiki torches. They're kind of commenting on it. And then fists of resistance. But these are all undercover. Like, if you don't necessarily notice them in the beginning. And so immediately after this exhibition, I was awarded a Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship, which was amazing. It was one of the first times that I was able to spend more than just a week or two in an archive. And so you apply for it. I hope it's still going to exist. And I was able to get my project green-lighted by a curator of photography and wound up working mostly in the Archive Center in DC at the National Museum of American History. And this is what it looks like. Literally for almost 2 months, I spent just going through, calling forward file folders, setting up a tripod, and in the way that I work, I just accumulate. I kind of hoard images, and I don't know necessarily what I'm going to do with them. But in this case, my idea was that I was going to try to look for images of the Philippines because I wanted to see what the empire saw of the Philippines. I wasn't looking for sort of proof of my own connection to heritage or any kind of identity in terms of who I was. I wanted to know what the American archive saw of its colony, which is a totally different reality, say, than what the country of the Philippines itself experiences. And so that was a very kind of broad premise. These are some of the images that came up. And so as I'm harvesting, I'm kind of looking for patterns. I'm also looking for anything that's kind of odd or intriguing, because it's not a very straightforward query. Like, some of these images are, you know, on the peripheries of the search. But, you know, as I'm going through it, I'm hoarding. And boy, yeah, I'm photographing documents. In a lot of cases, there's also surrogates, which mean in the archive, there's a copy of something that then I will copy and kind of acquire. And one of the projects that came out of this was a sort of display of a kind of a collapsed archive, or one in which the viewer was asked to sort of sift through a number of images on this large platform. This was the show Latent Images at Ryan Lee Gallery, which also featured a number of framed formal photographs alongside with this working platform. So as you approach the platform, it kind of, there wasn't really a solid kind of narrative that happened, but it was one in which I was attempting a kind of poetic juxtaposition of images or objects that somehow related to this search for the Philippines. And it's an unclear search, because in the end, I don't believe that the archive actually holds a very comprehensive or even clear look at its former colony. It's full of roundabout spaces. It's full of a lot of blurriness and also a lot of obscured or overlapping things. And in the end, I didn't, I know where each of these objects come from, but I didn't necessarily think it was important for the viewer to outright know. I just wanted a kind of poetic connection to happen. But some of the images that I did call forward were specific. And so they also were not necessarily about the Philippines, but they were about America's blurriness in thinking about itself and also in how it defines itself. And so in the 2 months of my search, I came across a lot of damaged objects that attempted to kind of share a story in some way. So this is a slide. It's labeled Better America, and it's part of a series of pedagogical lecture objects. What I liked about this was the image of whatever Better America was. Well, in this case, it's labeled poverty, was so damaged and so obscured that it turned into a kind of like color, a flickering color smear. And in thinking too about how looking back on American history, sometimes it's very unclear, I really started focusing on these types of images and objects to kind of tell a more open-ended story about what we propose is an American history. What you're seeing too here is, it's a little hard to describe, but this is a large-scale photograph, 60 inches by 40 inches, of I had taken a small image of this slide, printed it out on crappy 8.5 by 11 laser jet prints, taped them together, hung it on my wall, and then used a high-end digital camera to photograph that, and then print that in high resolution. And so all the pins and the tape marks and even the crumpled piece of paper on the side here is actually in the print. It's actually a photograph. It's not an actual dimensional piece. And so, you know, thinking through, when you blow up something really large, you also lose resolution. That was part of this. And using and knowing that the laser jet print itself was a terrible way to show the image was part of it. Along that image was, what do you do with files from the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan? You know, the American history is a checkered one, and these particular files were from an Ohio chapter of the Ku Klux Klan. And after opening the folder and looking at the propaganda in there, one of the ways I thought I could speak back to it was after looking at everything, I turned it over so it was facing downwards, and I photographed it from behind. So essentially negating whatever it was attempting to face forward. And so this becomes a kind of abstraction. It's blown up really large. It's again from the taped images, but it denies the ability of that history to speak in the way that it had intended to. And also, sometimes things just look beautiful on their own. So this is a fragment military officer, which is a Spanish officer in the Philippines around the 1890s. And it's a glass slide that's been so damaged just through time that it's flaking off. And bringing an image like this back to life was, it already did its work for me, honestly. All I had to do was print it out really crappy and then photograph it in high resolution. I like the foundness of some of these things. They really do lend itself to, to being really in the archive. And then I do, though, want to cap off this particular series with an image that really spoke to me of joy. So in the middle of finding, some of these problematic things, what really stood out to me was this image, or an entire box of images from a Ukrainian Jewish immigrant photographer named Alexander Alland, who moved to the United States in the 1930s and then took it upon himself to photograph immigrant communities in New York in an attempt to work against the anti-immigrant propaganda happening at the time. And so he's not a well-known photographer, which is really unfortunate, but he had taken photographs, in this one case, of Filipino women who were dancing. And so I photographed them in this box to kind of create, in a way, this like collaboration that happened almost 80 years after his initial photograph. And so this, the image to me is joyful. It's actually one of the most celebratory images I could find. And I was lucky enough, too, that it was recently acquired by the Smithsonian American Art Museum, which I think is this beautiful kind of like circular process of having found the image in one archive at the Smithsonian, and then it transfers into another different art archive, along with Alexander Alland's legacy, which I'm also attempting to kind of bring forward. So not long afterwards, I was invited to do a project with the Amon Carter Museum of American Art in Fort Worth, Texas. And so the curator, Kristen Gaylord, was lovely in the sense that when she invited me, she just said, okay, well, come by and look at our stuff and let's figure out what to do. And so as I started to kind of sift through the Amon Carter's collection, they're known for a very particular kind of work. It was founded on a collection that focused on Remington. And so the paintings and sculptures were of these very sort of typical cowboys and Indians style works. Whenever I do initial excavations into collections, I usually spend a couple days with the curator and we go through all the kind of areas that might be of interest. And I'm really interested especially in how objects are kind of cared for and put in a kind of a collection on display even without being on display. But invariably, these are the images that float the Amon Carter's audience. They're very heroic. They tell a very specific tale of the United States. And I was like, yeah, let's work with these. So in looking at the images or the paintings in the galleries, I started to really focus on the hands. It turns out that the hands are very gestural. When you pull out and you kind of see the landscapes or the groups of people, that's one kind of message. If you start focusing on the hands, they're also very verb-like. They're tugging things, they're pulling, they're shooting, they're reining in. They're active in this way that if you really focus on it, here they're like litigating or surveying, pointing, denying. And so these images, along with looking at these pretty interesting chromolithograph prints by Albert Bierstadt, who is a German immigrant artist who came and made some of the most iconic images of the American landscape, many of which were composites, however, and were meant to kind of like, create this very grandiose, and in many cases like empty field for a kind of vision of manifest destiny. How this translated though with the Amon Carter, I was very happy that we were able to create this installation that was at the front part of the museum. So you had to walk through this before entering the main gallery spaces. And the exhibition Double Vision hinged totally on works from the Amon Carter's collection, many of which were actually on display in the galleries upstairs. And so what it looked like was a kind of composite of the Bierstadt chromolithographs that were then doubled on themselves like a Rorschach test, as well as the man hands, as I like to call them, blown up and overlaid onto the landscape. Because if you focus on just this, you realize that these are the sorts of activities that have kind of worked on or even manipulated the notion of the American landscape, and even have enacted upon them the actions that we are now still living with today. And then there was also a digitally printed curtain that kind of amplified the theatrical quality of it. So I'm just going to go through this really quickly because we are running out of time. And then along with that work, on the other side of the wall, I worked with some of the bronze Remington sculptures where I became fascinated by how small they were. So even though they represented these very heroic ideas of the American West or the cowboy, they were actually quite modest in size. And when I paired them with, in this case, the preparator's hands, we did a photo shoot in which I faced the figures so that they were looking away from the camera, as if turning them around, and also shot against this kind of glossy black satin backdrop, essentially rendering them as small objects and leaving on them the acquisition tags, kind of taking them down and taking them out of their iconic status of these, heroic, larger-than-life figures. On the left-hand side is one of my favorites. That is the hands of the curator I was working with. I asked her to step in and be holding the measuring tape. And on the right-hand side is my hand with some of the collapsed color calibration charts that the staff photographer at the museum used to whenever they did their photo shoots. So in this case, I was employing the staff as well as, or not employing, they weren't paid to do my work, but I enlisted the staff as collaborators to work with me in being a part of the project. And the photographs themselves were 6 feet tall, so it's a little hard to tell, but then they became printed larger than life. And then this is the view when you're exiting the installation and into the rest of the museum to then see the actual artworks that these excerpted from. And then I love this image because this is how it was staged. If you pull back from the shots, the kind of imperfectness of this setup in the museum photo studio, I think talked a lot about the staging of art history, or the staging of these images to become part of the American iconography. So also thinking through museum collections as a type of forensics, I was commissioned to do a project with the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford, Connecticut. And so this is just a shot of one of their wonderful salon displays. When I was invited to work on it, we didn't really know what I was going to do either. And so the first thing I asked was can I see all your broken, dirty things? And so we went into the back, and there was, a museum collection invariably has things that they don't show. There's usually way more than what's able to be shown. And so I sifted through these. We decided against working in this direction, though, because it wouldn't exactly amplify the museum's collection in a way that seemed useful. But they did have an amazing conservation lab. And so I was able to go there and also look at some of the broken and damaged objects that were being fixed. And so this notion of care and how we steward and try to care for these objects that represent American history is also something I'm invested in, because it shows too that if damage is enacted on our memories of history or the object itself, what are we doing to kind of create these methods of care or repair? And how can that be a metaphor for maybe some of the things we're attempting today? One of the interesting objects that just happened to be in the conservation lab at the time was a bust by Hiram Powers, literally named America. And I thought it was interesting that America was damaged and sitting there, and they were attempting to fix her. I also wanted at some point to work with the collection of the Wadsworth was founded on money from the Colt family, which was the Colt arms manufacturing, the guns. And so they have this whole series of mounts that were produced to display the guns. And then I was also looking at their photo archives of images taken of all the paintings over the years before digital technology. So if someone wanted to reproduce a painting in a textbook or any other printed material, the museum would have to send these physical positives or negatives to be sent out and then eventually be returned. But invariably, the museum's most known for the Hudson River School collection. And it's one of the largest collections. It's something that I wound up focusing on, but I was more fascinated by the copy images and how over the years they had degraded in color and kind of shifted. And so this is, again, a Bierstadt painting that is one of the more famous paintings in the collection, but rendered, I rephotographed it with the labels and the kind of captioning that would have gone out with it. Because in a way, the museum itself is an overlay onto how this image is understood. So these are all large-scale photographs printed from their holdings. And the installation that was produced was a large vinyl, kind of like enveloping, oversized display. I wanted the viewer to kind of step into what appeared to be these history images or history paintings, but see it from the side of not a kind of truth-telling of what the landscape represented, but more of how everything was framed and presented through the lens of art history or the museum as somehow being, a part of American legacy. Paintings are fictions, but I think we have a tendency to forget that. Especially when looking at quote unquote older things, we treat them as if they were real somehow, as opposed to being upholding a kind of potential viewpoint or a commission, or maybe what the museum itself values as a narrative to promote. So the final installation also had a number of problematic paintings from the Wadsworth collection. And in re-showing these, I also wanted to critique them in a sense that this particular image, which was heavily trafficked by the Wadsworth, it's a painting from John Vanderlyn, which supposedly shows a kind of savage attack on a white woman, but which was used primarily as a kind of propaganda in terms of thinking of how savage Native peoples were. By spotlighting this and also showing images of the registrar's paperwork, which showed how often this image traveled and was sold to other reproduction spaces, the museum did profit off of this image in many ways. But one of the photographs that came out of this was literally using the staff photographer's tools, all the things that would kind of create the images of objects that were put on display, but pushing them to the center. So I had a lot of, I collaborated with the staff photographer there, and we made this kind of still life of their practice in front of the where the museum object would ordinarily be displayed. So it was this kind of inversion of everything outside of the frame in the frame. And then lastly, I'm going to finish up with this project, which is up right now at the Bishop Museum in Hawaii as part of the Hawaii Triennial. This is a collaboration in a way with the Bernice Pauahi Bishop Museum, and it's repurposed museum display casements, plinths, and object mounts from their collection. And it's at first you approach it and you see objects, but in the end, the object mounts themselves, these are the objects that would, or the mounts that would hold cultural objects from the collection, are empty. And so they've been either vacated or released or let go in some way. And they're dotted around with photographs, digitally manipulated photographs of what were images of Filipinos taken using a kind of ethnographic lens at the time. These were American images in which I've digitally released them from having to occupy that photograph. So I use, in Photoshop, I use this tool called the healing brush tool. I don't know if folks are familiar with it. It's kind of ironic because I don't think you can exactly heal history. It's also an imperfect process. You rub the healing brush tool on the image and it attempts to kind of fill it in with textures or images around it, but inherently it's an imperfect process and you're left with this kind of smudgy phantom remnant. And as I release the images, or as I release the figures, I'm not erasing them. I'm letting them go. I'm letting them exit and not be in the having to live conscribed in this way anymore. And so I like these odd stutters. I like the difficulty that happens as a result and the kind of uncanniness. They're not perfect and they're not meant to be. It's an imperfect system. And so the installation itself is almost like a hall of mirrors. It reflects back on itself in different ways. The object mounts themselves also become sculptures. It's not really, to me, about a kind of lack or emptiness. It's a proposition for, you know, is there such a way, can we have a post-colonial reality in which these object mounts themselves can almost hold a sort of modernist space, like a way for us to appreciate them being empty, and instead of seeing it as a lack, that maybe there's something inherent in the way these the mounts themselves cared for temporarily the things that then have left us. So I think, yeah, I'm gonna end here, this is an image of the, making these installations is really exciting because you invariably have to pull from existing museum objects. And so here's what it looked like. I had to show up there and then quickly kind of pull together. This was all mounts from literally their last show. So I reconfigured almost their entire last exhibition in a new way, along with images, about 60 of my photographs that were added onto it. So I'm going to end right there, which gives us plenty of time for questions and answers. Thank you so much. So how shall we open this up? What is the best way?
I think if you want to just stand up and ask your question loudly, and then you can answer it.
So thank you, Stephanie. That was really wonderful. We're in such a time of a kind of like political, historical, and technological acceleration. And I'm wondering how that has contributed to maybe you seeing your own work in new contexts, as our kind of present is in a very slippery place.
Yeah, oof, God. You know, I missed sharing, so I cut out a lot of other works that the earlier work, say like from 2018, right, with the green screen dresses and everything, I thought that work actually was about this temporary moment. When you're talking about acceleration or, you know, fast-moving time, I kind of think about how when I made that work 8 years? No. How long? Do math for me. 7 years ago. You know, I was like, this work is going to be so outdated soon. You know, we're going to get over whatever the issue was then. And then I look back on it now and I'm like, God damn it. You know, this is like recurring. It's recurring and recurring and recurring. So even though things move forward quickly, I actually think we're in this like crazy loop. You know, like it's really difficult to get outside of the issues that seem to, you know, have been circulating for a while. And I don't know if that answers the question for you. Do you want to add anything onto that?
I guess I'm also curious about the kind of position of technology keeps shifting
Oh.
and how we interact with that. But also the kind of, as we kind of jerk through these different moments and we're kind of pulled in a way that feels so destabilizing. So much of your work operates in a kind of space of friction and instability and inscrutability, and yet there's a kind of parallel with where we are now, and I'm just, those two things seem to be in constant motion, and I wonder if that kind of creates new connections or realizations.
Ooh, I want you to write my a catalog essay. That sounds great. I don't know. I've been grappling a lot with image veracity, like AI, as a kind of, fast way that people seem to be generating thought images, and how that pulls also from a kind of archive, right? Like an existing archive of images that feed it, whether it's like, everyday snapshots all the way to like formal, like artist or photographer, attributable photographers. And I don't know. I mean, I guess like, I don't know how to answer that question, I guess. I guess I'm very worried, but I don't know how to, what to do about that. Oh. Anyone else? Yeah.
I'm really curious about the project where you hand sewed costumes, and you made it a point to tell us that you personally did the labor, the crafting. There's also your project at the Smithsonian where you physically covered parts of the photographs, and so, but at the same time you wanted to let us know that you weren't interested in delving into a kind of personal relation to that archive.
Yeah.
And yet there is a kind of insistence on the presence of your body and your labor, and I'm curious to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, no, thanks for pointing that out. Yeah, so two things. Well, one is I always like to say that my work actually, there's a tendency to say that an artist of color makes work about identity if they somehow touch on issues of like a recognizable either, ethnic or cultural heritage or something like that. I don't think my work is about that at all. And so I think it's actually about the white gaze, G-A-Z-E. And which is a totally different thing. But my edition of my body in the archive when I take the photographs is, I guess it's almost like saying proof. I know that sounds like weird, right? But because we're so used to seeing digitally manipulated images, I also wanted it to be like, no, I'm spending time here doing this thing, and I'm literally touching those photos, which I shouldn't be doing. And so, granted, they're copy photos; they're not the originals. But still, there's a kind of way that we're also supposed to use the archive, and it's one of like reverence or care or that kind of thing. And then I wonder sometimes if there's a way to act with the archive in a different way if we're physically with it. I also do think that it's a privilege to have your body physically in an archive. It costs money to haul yourself over there. It costs time, and so many of us work with archives remotely or through a distance, or we have to apply for grants to get there. I wanted that kind of physical commitment because of how quickly images circulate, so maybe similar more like to the Dodge and Burn installation, where it was kind of about that massive circulation of things that may or may not, relate properly to each other. Thanks. Anyone else? Looks like we have someone over there.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very provocative. So I love how you use things of like making the invisible visible, and then in the projects that were just referenced, like Block Out the Sun, where you're covering the photographs, or here in Blind Spot, you're choosing these photographs that you've repurposed. Were there ever any photographs that you came across in archives that you thought, I'm not going to make this visible, or I'm not going to cover it, for whatever reason?
Or say in this, right? So I specifically only do this to images of Filipinos, actually. So it turns out in Hawaii, there are a lot of other communities and cultures represented in archives. I also didn't feel like I had any I wasn't able to, or I did not want to change or interface works in which I didn't have some kind of like connection to, because I actually don't come from the communities that they speak to. And I don't want to, to say I know better than what another person would do with those images. So I think, I do think a little bit about, it's not ownership, because I don't own these images at all, but that, the connection I can speak to with them. Other than that, I think I left out maybe, or I didn't want to re-show some of the more really degrading images that even if I covered them up, they just sort of stuck with me as just being really not great. So yeah, there's a little bit of an ethics in there. Yeah. Anyone else? Back there.
Thanks for your lecture. I have maybe a more abstract question about the relationship between, that you have with scale in your work. Because in some of the installations, it really feels like kind of manipulations, like in the sculpture photographs, for example. That's an obvious case where the manipulation of scale, or here, is really important. But even when you're constructing like line slots, much smaller kind of bits and pieces together, it feels like in the context of the room, it really matters that you're asking us to look closely. So I'm just wondering if that feels like a primary frame.
Yeah, so I think, let's see, so I've, because sometimes it's a matter too of the space I've been given, honestly. So if they're like, okay, you have this space, you've got two 50-foot walls, or 100-foot walls, what are you gonna do with that? And I'm like, all right, let's just make it the most theatrically, kind of absorbing space. Because if I'm talking about, say, staging or a kind of, falling into or a fabricated enveloping space, it sort of has to operate that way. But then also pairing it hopefully with a kind of intimacy, because even I think the this installation, from a distance, it just looks kind of like, woof, here's this big exhibition, and then you have to peer really closely to see the images. And so there was a lot of like close looking and moving around through the space to see things. So yeah, maybe the scale kind of like shifts in different ways on these.
It does. It does feel to me like a relationship to history too, right? The scale of history and the kind of how we interface with that as concept. Kind of seems.
Well, also pictures, most photographs that you encounter in an archive, it's a very intimate experience. You sit there at a table, you've got a file folder open, and it's just you looking at it. And it's this very kind of personal relationship. And so to somehow make it a public experience is an interesting challenge for that. Yeah.
I'm curious to hear about kind of your trajectory of making different kinds of work. It's interesting to think about the sculpture and installation and social practice work that you were doing before this really deep and rich dive into working with archives. And it seems like you're in a really distinct place in your practice. And I don't know how you would kind of like narrate that arc or reflect on kind of how you've arrived here in relationship to those really distinct ways of making that preceded this investment.
That's a nice question, yeah. So museums are social spaces also, right? With like staff and curators and the public and students and educators and everything. And so in a way, the quote unquote social practice projects I used to do has kind of transferred onto institutions. And there's a lot of invisible like dialogue that happens. And I'm not saying at all that like I'm incorporating all of it into my practice, but I found that experience has been useful to sort of like pick through or negotiate what can or can't happen. Because in the end, even if we say that this work might have critical moments, you also have to get a kind of buy-in and agreement with the institution about what's happening. And in many cases, it's not about saying like, bad institution, all you show are cowboys. It's really like, people, the people who are tasked to steward this history may or may not agree with that history. They still are part of the, of caring for it, whether they like it or not. And so I think that that's then where it's actually more realistic to think about this friction that we all have to do in terms of negotiating where we are in not a dichotomy of position, but this like very odd space, You know, like, I mean, I can also say, like, I'm a university professor at one of the largest public universities on the, in the country, and I have a very fraught relationship sometimes with this university, but at the same time, I will defend the university because I do believe in the end that it does a public good. So it's, I believe similarly in what happens in these types of institutions. Anyone else? Oh, there we go.
Hi. I'm wondering, you talked a bit about, especially in the early one when you had like the dresses that you had sewn, how you like took a full year to learn those skills.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of wondering
Go
like
there.
how you go about, like some projects seem to be led by like skill sets you've already developed and ones that you've like honed for many years versus like a project that's led by you learning new skills and applying them. So just like how you kind of navigate like projects built on new skills versus project built on like skills you've already acquired and how you kind of blend the two.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I used to also, I should share this, I used to work as an exhibition designer at a museum. So I actually have a background in designing spaces and working with scientists, educators, and artists to create displays. And so I was able to, that's how I know how to make like large vinyl graphics and things like that. I mean, it's weird, right? It actually shows in the work. Like I make museum displays. And so I have also just by picking up skills as a sculpture person and trying to incorporate it as best as possible. I used to do more kind of like textiles and craft-based things, which is then, you know, what led to the, what led to all the other, oh my God, I have to go through all this, I'm so sorry, to this work. But I do want to say, then sometimes it's like, it just takes time, you know, like you have to commit. Like this idea that all work can be made really fast, or because we're digitally inclined now, we can just kind of whip out these things. Like in order to learn from these like literally 19th century sources, like I was looking at old, like, is it Harper's magazine? Yeah, and like, you know, these like vintage sources, I wanted to carry forward that kind of like making to prove a point too, right? That even if we can do something very quick, this history, the knowledge embodied through your hands to make this is part of the ability to then critique it. I think we're good. But thank you very much, everyone. Appreciate it.